From the very first episode of Dexter, one thing was clear. James Doakes was different. He wasn't fooled by Dexter's fake smiles, his box of donuts, or his quiet persona. James Doakes was the only one who ever saw through Dexter Morgan's mask. While everyone else at Miami Metro fell for his act, Doakes knew something was off, and he never let it go. But what if he had survived? Would he have exposed Dexter? Would Miami Metro have finally seen the truth? Or would Dexter have found a way to silence him for good? If Doakes had lived, Dexter's world would have collapsed. Because survival wouldn't have been enough, Doakes would have come back harder, more determined than ever to take Dexter down. Think about it. He had already been framed as the Bay Harbor Butcher. Even LaGuerta, his biggest supporter, had struggled to defend him. If he returned to Miami Metro, half dead and claiming Dexter was the real killer, would anyone have believed him? Or would they have dismissed him as a desperate man trying to clear his name? But here's where it gets even worse for Dexter. What if the police had found Doakes first? Instead of a burned-up body, they pull him out of the wreckage, barely alive. Now, Dexter wouldn't just be dealing with suspicion. He'd be dealing with an active police investigation he couldn't control. For the first time, he wouldn't be the one pulling the strings. No more framing, no more manipulating, no more easy way out. And when a predator loses control, that's when things spiral. If Doakes had survived, even for a moment longer than Dexter expected, the entire trajectory of the show would have changed. But survival alone wouldn't have been enough. He wouldn't just have to live, he would have to fight to be believed. Let's say he wasn't completely obliterated in the explosion. Maybe he managed to get free just in time, injured but conscious enough to know he had to run. Even then, he had a nearly impossible task ahead of him. Think about it. He was already labeled the Bay Harbor Butcher. Dexter's setup was airtight. Even LaGuerta, his strongest ally, had struggled to defend him before his disappearance. So, if Doakes had made it back to Miami Metro, bruised and half-dead, screaming that Dexter Morgan was the real killer, would anyone have believed him? Or would they have seen a desperate fugitive trying to clear his name? But here's a more realistic scenario. What if the police had found him? If officers arrived at the wreckage of the cabin and discovered Doakes clinging to life, this would have triggered something Dexter had never dealt with before. An active police investigation he couldn't control. Now, things get really complicated. Because Dexter's entire cover relied on working in the background, manipulating situations before they reached the point of no return. If Doakes survived and was in police custody, suddenly Dexter wasn't in control anymore. He couldn't just disappear him like his usual victims. He couldn't sneak in and finish the job without raising even more suspicion. He would have to adapt. Would he try to stage an accident in the hospital? Would he attempt to spin an even greater lie to turn Miami Metro further against Doakes? The point is, if Doakes lived, Dexter wouldn't have had an easy way out. He would have had to think bigger, act smarter, and for the first time in his life, play defense instead of offense. And that's where things start to spiral. If Doakes had returned to Miami Metro, bruised, battered, and screaming the truth, the reaction would have been anything but simple. His biggest problem wouldn't have been just proving his innocence. It would have been convincing anyone that Dexter, the quiet, nerdy, blood-spatter analyst, was actually the Bay Harbor Butcher. Think about Doakes' reputation. He was already seen as aggressive, volatile, and a loose cannon. Before his disappearance, he had been obsessed with Dexter, stalking him, threatening him, and even getting himself suspended. To most of Miami Metro, his sudden reappearance wouldn't have made Dexter look guilty. It would have made Doakes look insane, a desperate man grasping at straws to clear his own name. And Maria LaGuerta? She had always believed in Doakes, but would she have been able to fight for him? If she pushed too hard, she risked alienating herself from the department. After all, the Bay Harbor Butcher case had closed. The city had its scapegoat. Reopening the investigation would mean tearing down an entire task force's work. It would mean challenging Lundy, an FBI agent whose reputation was built on catching serial killers. Would she have had enough influence to push back against the official narrative? But the real wild card here, Dexter himself. Because if Doakes had survived, Dexter would have been trapped. He couldn't just kill him outright. Doakes had already escaped once, and if he mysteriously vanished again, even the most oblivious cops in Miami Metro would start asking questions. No, Dexter would have needed a new plan. Maybe he'd double down on discrediting Doakes, planting evidence to make him look unstable. Maybe he'd find a way to make Doakes disappear legally, a false charge, a forced transfer, something that took him out of Miami for good. Or, in the darkest scenario of all, would Dexter have framed someone else? If he couldn't kill Doakes, maybe he would have needed another fall guy. Someone whose guilt could be proven just enough to keep Doakes from ever getting his justice. If Doakes had lived, Dexter's carefully constructed world would have begun to crumble. For the first time, he wouldn't just be evading suspicion, he would be actively hunted. Doakes was relentless. Unlike the rest of Miami Metro, he didn't buy into Dexter's good guy act. He wouldn't be swayed by the donuts, the awkward smiles, or the fake humility. And more importantly, he wouldn't stop digging. That's the real danger here. Because in the world of Dexter, secrets only stay buried when no one is looking. And Doakes? He'd be looking all the time. Now, picture this. Dexter, a predator by nature, suddenly becoming the prey. Every move scrutinized, every unexplained absence noted. He wouldn't be able to slip away unnoticed anymore. No more late-night stakeouts, no more spontaneous trips to the marina. Doakes would be watching, waiting for him to slip up. And here's where things really start to unravel. Miami Metro itself. At first, they might write Doakes off as paranoid. After all, Dexter was a respected member of the team. But suspicion is like a virus. It spreads. Once Doakes planted that seed of doubt, it would only take one or two key people to start wondering, how does Dexter always know so much? Why is he always near the action? And the biggest wild card? Dexter Morgan. She loved Dexter, trusted him blindly. But for how long? Doakes wasn't just some random detective with a grudge. He was a former Special Forces operative, trained to detect threats. If he made a strong enough case, if he showed her just enough inconsistencies, would she have started to question the brothers she thought she knew? This is where everything changes. Because Dexter had spent years perfecting his double life, making sure no one ever looked too closely. But if Doakes had survived, there would be no more hiding in plain sight, no more carefully staged coincidences, no more control. And here's the real question. How long can a man like Dexter survive when the walls start closing in? If Doakes had survived, Dexter's world would have collapsed piece by piece. He had spent years perfecting the art of balance, managing his dark urges while keeping up the mask of a normal life. But with Doakes alive, that balance would have shattered. And Dexter? He wouldn't have had the luxury of patience anymore. There are only two ways a predator reacts when it's cornered. It either escapes or it attacks. And escape? That wasn't really an option. If Dexter disappeared overnight, that alone would have raised too many questions. Deb would never stop looking for him. Miami Metro would start connecting dots. His entire cover relied on blending in, on never giving anyone a reason to scrutinize him. But with Doakes hunting him, every move would have been under a microscope. Every crime scene, every late-night absence, every case where his instincts were a little too perfect, it would all be used against him. So if he couldn't run, that left only one option: elimination. But unlike his usual kills, Doakes wasn't just another criminal. He was a trained hunter, a man who had already survived Dexter's first attempt to silence him. That changed the rules. Killing Doakes wouldn't be as simple as plastic wrap and a scalpel. This would have required planning, a perfect execution, one that didn't lead back to him. Or maybe, Dexter would have gone in an entirely different direction. Instead of trying to eliminate Doakes physically, he could have destroyed him reputationally. He had already framed him once. What's stopping him from doing it again? The problem is, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Even Miami Metro's incompetence has its limits. A second takedown of Doakes would have raised too many red flags. So that leaves the worst-case scenario. Dexter being forced to abandon his double life entirely. Imagine that. No more controlled, methodical kills. No more Code of Harry to justify his actions. He'd either have to fully integrate into normal society, something he had never been able to do, or fully embrace the chaos of being a fugitive. This is where the illusion of Dexter's control completely unravels. Because deep down, even with all his planning, all his precision, he was never as untouchable as he believed. And with Doakes alive, that delusion would have been shattered forever. If Doakes had lived and kept pushing, things would have started to crack. Maybe not immediately. Miami Metro wasn't exactly known for its sharp investigative skills, but eventually, even the most oblivious cops start noticing when something doesn't add up. The first problem? Trust. Doakes had already been painted as a rogue cop, someone who had supposedly gone off the rails and started murdering criminals. Even if he came back alive, his reputation was in shambles. His only real ally might have been LaGuerta, but even she had limits. Going against the FBI's official ruling on the Bay Harbor butcher case? That's career suicide. But Doakes wasn't stupid. He wouldn't have just claimed Dexter was the butcher. He would have hunted for proof. And here's where things get dangerous for Dexter. Because no matter how careful he was, he left traces. The blood slides, the kill room setups, the marina. If Doakes had enough time, he would have found something. And then you have Deb. She was the wild card in all of this. What would it have taken for her to believe it? Maybe she wouldn't have at first. Maybe she would have fought against the idea that her own brother could be a serial killer. But Doakes was persuasive, and if she started paying attention, really paying attention, would she have started seeing the cracks in Dexter's carefully constructed lies? But then, the real question: what would Dexter do once he realized Doakes wasn't stopping? Killing him outright would have been too risky. Framing him again would have been suspicious. That leaves one final, desperate option: disappearing entirely. If Doakes had gotten too close, if Deb had started to doubt, if Miami Metro was just one step away from putting it all together, would Dexter have chosen to run? Would he have left everything behind to protect his secret? Because once Doakes got close enough, Dexter's days were numbered. Now here's a crazy thought. What if Doakes, instead of trying to take Dexter down, used him? We've seen it before. Frank Lundy was obsessed with catching killers. Miguel Prado wanted in on Dexter's world. And even Hannah McKay, a killer herself, saw the appeal of what Dexter did. What if Doakes had, at some point, realized that the only way to beat Dexter was to control him? Could he have forced Dexter into a deal? Could he have turned him into a weapon instead of an enemy? Doakes had a military background. He understood that sometimes the wrong people slip through the cracks. What if he started feeding Dexter names, criminals that the system had failed? Would that have made Doakes just as much of a monster, or was he already one? At the end of the day, there's one undeniable fact. Doakes was never going to let Dexter live in peace. Even if he had survived, even if he had gathered enough proof, Dexter's instinct to protect himself would have kicked in. And that means one thing: one of them wouldn't have made it to the final season. So who wins? If Doakes had lived, would Dexter have met his downfall sooner? Would Miami Metro have connected the dots before it was too late? Or would Dexter have found a way to once again slip through the cracks? One thing is certain: if James Doakes had lived, Dexter would have never been the same. So, what do you think? Would Doakes have been the one to finally bring Dexter down? Or would Dexter have found another way to survive? Let me know your thoughts. And if you've made it this far, congrats! You clearly have a dark passenger of your own, always craving the next deep dive into Dexter's mind. So why not make it official? Subscribe and join the dark side. No code required. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.